Hello and welcome, my name is Haas, and this is an advanced For Honor guide all about the Warlord class. I'll briefly go over the basics of the Warlord, but I'll mainly talk about advanced maneuvers so you too can fully utilize your tri-wielding, sword, shield and headbutt, Viking. Currently the Warlord is in an incredibly good state. In fact, he's easily one of the top tier strongest fighters in the game, with great defensive potential, as you might expect from a heavy, but equal aggressive potential, and a great way to get guaranteed damage in against a defensive opponent, in addition to being quite forgiving to play, honestly. But even though that may be the case, the Warlord definitely has a lot of small elements that together combine to create a very high mastery potential. His kit allows him to play both very reactively, with access to what is most likely the strongest parry follow-up in the game, in addition to being able to trade effectively with his heavy attacks or put on the pressure with stamina removal tools that crucially allow him to sneak in guaranteed damage to slowly whittle his enemies down with. So let's go over the basics first. To start with, the Warlord doesn't have any elaborate chain combos to work with. He merely has two: focus strikes and hack and slash. Hack and slash is quite simply a heavy into a light, and focus strikes is a light into a heavy. Chances are you won't be using these a lot because the Warlord's heavy and light attacks are all very slow, one of his few weaknesses, in addition to having very short range. This means that relying on these chains opens you up to parries from the enemy, or at the very least are most likely going to be blocked. Of course, like most chains, you can start a chain by purposely missing with one attack first, and then following it up to initiate the chain if you think the enemy won't react properly in time. But again, the Warlord's attacks have very short range. That is not to say they are useless. You'll no doubt use one of them every so often when you're putting on the aggression, but you don't really need to keep them in mind. Notably, his top heavy attacks are the quickest heavy attacks, which is relatively unique as most fighters have slower top heavies, and his heavy attacks all have the uninterruptible startup property, allowing you to effectively trade damage with them. I'd be remiss not to mention his superior block on light attacks startup. This is not a property you'll end up relying a lot on, as generally parries are better, and once more his light attacks being relatively slow, they aren't necessarily safer either against a competent opponent. But if you find you're being pressured by the enemy's light attacks, it might be good to throw out a light attack instead of going for a parry, resulting in you blocking their attack while causing some minimal damage. Essentially, this property just makes your mix-up game with light attacks safer and helps stave off light attack pressure, but doesn't do a whole lot for your overall game plan. No, the Warlord's bread and butter are his heavy attacks, which leads me to the basic move, Head Splitter Leap. Head Splitter Leap has three versions. The regular Head Splitter Leap is done while sprinting and pressing the heavy attack button. The alternate version is done while locked on by dashing forward and pressing the heavy attack button, and his Head Splitter Leap combo is done by combining a Head Splitter alternative, again dashing forward and pressing heavy, into a guard break and immediately guaranteed light attack damage if the guard break connected. All these Head Splitter Leap versions aren't something you'll be relying on a lot either, as you can't feint these attacks and they have quite a long wind-up, meaning most enemies will simply parry your attack or at the very least dodge it. But this once more allows you to mix up your playstyle and potentially surprise an enemy with. Notably, Head Splitter Leap does have a lot of range, making it quite a good catch-up ability. Well then, why are his heavies good? Why do you rely on these the most for damage? To answer that, we'll first go over the Warlord's full block stance done by pressing the particular full block stance button. When you activate this, the Warlord will become stationary and he'll block damage from all directions. Notably, the Warlord has superior block while in this stance. Full block stance is the least forgiving and one of the hardest elements to properly utilize as a Warlord, because it drains a ton of stamina when activated and further drains stamina while you're in it. Basically, you never want to stay in this stance and instead want to time it right before an enemy hits you. Because this stance has the superior block property, it'll incur recovery frames on the enemy that you can now exploit through his moves listed as Ward and Blade and Block and Stab. Essentially, when you block an attack in full block stance, you can always get a guaranteed light attack in. However, when you block an attack in this stance, you can also opt to go for a heavy attack. This heavy attack will always come from your left and will always connect unless the enemy is blocking on that side. In other words, if an enemy attacks your left side, you shouldn't use a heavy attack, and you should go for a guaranteed light attack instead. If the enemy isn't attacking your left side, you can get a heavy attack in if you successfully block them. Once more though, this stance is difficult to properly use and should be used incredibly sparingly due to its immense stamina cost, but it allows you to effectively counterattack. Instead of a heavy or light, you can also press the guard break button while in this stance to initiate his so-called Headbutt riposte. Which brings me to what is likely the most iconic and probably most annoying element of the Warlord to deal with, his forehead. Headbutts are incredibly easy to spam and incredibly effective, but notably Headbutt riposte, the headbutt initiated out of a full block stance, is far worse than the regular version, as it is significantly slower. In general, you never want to follow a full block stance up with a headbutt, but instead want to accurately use either a heavy or a light if they're attacking from your left side. So to get back to the headbutt, normally you initiate this attack by dashing forward and pressing the guard break button. This is your aggressive line of play. This is where you can easily start piling on the pressure. The headbutt is incredibly fast, unblockable, and as such hard to dodge for the enemy. It incurs very few recovery frames on the Warlord, and it allows you to immediately follow it up with a guaranteed light attack, which is an incredibly effective way of dealing with a defensive player, and is one of the reasons why the Warlord is easily top tier. In addition to the guaranteed light you can follow it up with, the headbutt itself incurs a small stamina penalty to your enemy. This stamina penalty isn't as big as similar abilities from other fighters, but it's enough to pressure an enemy with and prevents them from regaining stamina for a few crucial seconds while they're exhausted. Stamina removal and guaranteed light damage, which you can potentially chain into a heavy attack, granted they can of course parry the chain. Important then is to realize the one weakness of the headbutt, and this will be your saving grace against a headbutt spamming Warlord in the Warlord vs Warlord mirror. The enemy can, difficult as it may be, dodge the headbutt. Again, this is hard to pull off and it varies in difficulty depending on how quick their class is, but in the Warlord mirror, this is important to keep in mind, as a dodged headbutt allows the enemy, or you in the mirror, to get a free guard break off on your opponent. So if a Warlord is spamming this, dodge it and guard break him for guaranteed heavy damage. If your enemy is aware of this and you find they're trying to dodge your headbutt, you can also utilize this knowledge to force them into a 50-50 gamble. A headbutt is done by dashing forward and following it up immediately with the guard break button. Instead of following it up, you can simply dash forward, wait for them to dodge, and then perform a normal guard break, which they now can't counter, as they just dodged. Final note on the amazing headbutt, this ability also knocks enemies down to the ground if you are in revenge mode, which can be especially helpful in the team modes. Now, I've briefly mentioned guard breaks, and you'll find the Warlord doesn't rely on these as directly as some others, but one thing you need to keep in mind is that your only follow-up in a guard break is a top-heavy attack. As I mentioned earlier, the Warlord's top-heavy is the quickest, and it's the only heavy guarantee to hit when you have your enemy in a guard break. Generally, you would perform a guard break after parrying an enemy, but the Warlord has an even better tool than a regular guard break, named the shield counter. Shield counter is performed by successfully parrying an enemy attack and immediately pressing the guard break button. The timing is quite tight, and the result is immensely effective as it drains roughly 70% of the enemy's stamina, likely causing them to be exhausted because you just parried them as well for a further stamina reduction after they spent stamina on their attack. In addition, this also dazes your opponent, making it harder for them to read what you're doing. But most importantly, exactly like the full block stance, this allows you to hit them with a guaranteed heavy attack, providing they didn't attack you from the left side, as your heavy attack after a shield counter is always going to be from your left. Not to mention, shield counter very effectively tracks your opponent, meaning that a Shigoki or Nobushi, who normally have relatively safe heavies as they are too far away from an immediate guard break after being parried, will still get hit by a shield counter and a heavy follow-up, again if they didn't attack from your left side. Shield counter is then generally the best move to use after a parry, but knowing when not to use it and instead delaying for a little bit to use a regular guard break after parry is one of the tiny elements that leads to mastering the Warlord. In general, if they attack from your left side, you can't punish them with a shield counter into heavy, meaning that in those circumstances, it's better to instead go for a parry into regular guard break, which guarantees a top heavy attack. This is also where we get into the realm of specific matchups, of course. Again, a Nobushi or Shigoki, in addition to the Lawbringer and Valkyrie, can normally be hit by a free guard break after their heavy attacks were parried, meaning in those cases a shield counter is still better. Against assassins, you actually have a decent shot at connecting the heavy follow-up after a shield counter, even if they attack from the left, because their guard is on a timer, but it is not guaranteed. Then the final interaction the Warlord has with the guard break button involves his throws and an ability called Crashing Charge, which can only be done while sprinting. Crashing Charge is effectively the same as throwing an opponent and pushing the enemy backwards, but unless they hit a wall, they won't be effectively disabled, meaning its use is relatively rare. But if you see them positioned near a wall or cliffside, it can be used to great effect. The Warlord's normal throws then, done by pressing the guard break button after you effectively initiated the guard break, are basically the best throws in the game, as they have incredible range and allow you to move your enemy in any direction by turning the camera. Again, this can be useful if your enemy is near a wall or cliffside and is one of the few moments in which you can hit them with a side heavy, which does a little bit more than a top heavy, but besides those cases, going for a guaranteed top heavy is generally still the most effective course of action. Finally, the Warlord also has incredibly effective zone attacks. His zone attacks deal slightly less than heavy attack damage, are incredibly fast, but do cost quite a chunk of stamina and have relatively short range. His zone attacks are basically his best regular attacks, however. Keep in mind you can always try and execute a zone attack during a parry window, which means that if the enemy feints, you will hit them with a zone attack instead. And if they don't, you will parry them. This allows you to parry more safely, but it doesn't allow you to feint yourself. This zone attack is especially useful against assassins because of its incredible speed, and if they dodge to the right, they will still get hit because of the arc. And with that, we have an advanced overview of the Warlord. Your playstyle of course has to vary depending on your matchup, but the Warlord can play really effectively, both defensively and aggressively. He's one of the few fighters with guaranteed damage, has the best throw in the game, the best parry follow-up in the game, and a very forgiving headbutt to put a pressure with. He's not unstoppable, again the headbutt can be dodged and punished with a guard break, faster classes can even punish this by dodging to the side and attacking, and his full block stance is a huge stamina drain. In addition, his feint game is a little on the weak side because of his slow attacks, but nevertheless he is easily top tier. If you plan on mastering the Warlord, you do have a lot to look at, despite his relatively forgiving nature. Head Splitter is fast, has good range and deals good damage, but opens yourself up to parries and thus must be used unpredictably. Knowing to use a regular guard break instead of a shield counter is something you will have to read very quickly in a fight if they attack your left side, and similarly, this also applies to using a light instead of a heavy out of a full block stance, which is a very tough stance to use to begin with. I hope this guide proves useful. Thank you for watching, my name is Ben Haas, and I'll see you in the next video.